All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. How are you? Whoever you are, new person, returning listener, thanks. I appreciate that you are choosing to listen to this. If you've been around for the last few weeks, you know I've been focusing some on the possibility and also hard realities of brick and mortar yoga classes. It seems like I hit a nerve. There was a lot of response from folks out there. Really appreciate everybody engaging in that conversation. There's more to it. We're going to be continuing it. Some folks reached out, and I'm going to be checking back in with some other people so we can get some further perspective on that. I think there's something important there. So cheers to everybody for listening and engaging. Today, we are going back to where I was right before I took that little sojourn into brick and mortar yoga classes. Regular listeners, you remember that I have also been focused some of late on yoga philosophy and theology. And I think some of those conversations aren't for everyone because they kind of get into the weeds, and sometimes, I don't know, they can feel not as rewarding or gratifying in certain ways, depending on where you are in your life and what kind of interest you have in getting into the nitty and gritty of text sources and different philosophical ideas and trying to put words to things that don't even really have words for them. I, in general, as a practitioner and a teacher, have always been more interested in actual and practical applications of both techniques and of wisdom, of understanding in ways that people feel empowered by instead of feeling like judgment around. And I think also for many people, we have had experiences with yoga practice, especially if you're a teacher, where you see things happen through practice just from doing the simple breathing and moving practices in an appropriate context and with a heart relationship connection involved. Stuff happens. You see it. You see it happen in the course of your own life, and you see it in other people, even down to the simple thing where you observe people come to your class and there's a certain energy and people are a certain way with themselves and each other. And then through the course of like an hour of doing breathing and moving with folks, it shifts. Something happens. And then at the end of the class, when everybody's standing around, you can see, wow, something's different now. We affected our systems and our relationship to ourselves and others in this practice ritual. And you see it and you say, okay, well, how does that happen? How does that work? What's going on in that? And you can look at that through a lot of different lenses. A lot of people look at it through a physiological lens. We want to understand what's happening in our body and our nervous systems and our respiratory systems. And all of that's very interesting and cool. And we've had people on the show to talk about that. But I also think that as I've gotten older, at least, one of the only other ways that you come to understand it more is looking at text and looking at scripture and finding people who can engage with you in those in ways that help you understand, because just reading them in translations or watching lectures, it's not the same thing as having a chance to really interact with a teacher and to kind of try to stumble through finding words for what you're thinking and your questions, and, you know, having to work through that in real time with somebody is an invaluable experience that I don't get to have much outside of doing this show. It's one of the wonderful blessings of doing this podcast is that it gives me an excuse sometimes to get to ask some questions of teachers that I would really want to ask these questions of. And today's talk is a perfect example of it. My guest is Gary Kraftsow. And For those of you who know me and know how much I'm inspired by the teachings of TKV Desikachar, anytime someone comes on this show who has had any direct experience with Desikachar, I always ask them like the same series of questions. And recently those questions were about that very first book entitled Religiousness in Yoga. And well, Gary was there, and Gary has firsthand experience and understanding of a lot of the questions that I have been asking, more than I actually knew. I didn't even realize until I had this chance to speak to him how much Gary's been focused on the exact questions that I've been asking. So it was just a perfect and profound blessing for me to get this opportunity to talk to him right at the moment I did. And it's just a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me just mention that I have some upcoming events in Manchester, England, and Dublin, Ireland this month. So if you can get to either of those places, I don't know how many live events I'm really going to be able to do this year. Those are like the two on the schedule now, and we might not have many more opportunities to hang out together in person. So if you can make it there, September 23rd and 24th and September 30th and October 1st, those 2 weekends, let's hang out. If you can come, please do. If you can't make it to those, there's still lots of ways for us to be able to connect. I got a new teacher training group starting soon. So listen, you can find all the stuff, the live events, and all the other ways that we might engage with each other. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, that's it. We've got a lot to get to, and I would like to do that. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Gary Kraftsow. Hi, Gary.
Nice to see you, sir.
Nice to see you.
It was nice to connect last week.
It was. I was very glad to do it, and I'm grateful for you to give me this time today. Thank you.
It's really a pleasure. I mean, we shared together what my concerns were, and I feel like other than that, I'm really happy to support you in what you're doing and to have this opportunity to share whatever it is that we talk about with your community.
Well, I'm excited to get a chance to talk to you right now. I'm recording, so I would like to consider us having just begun right now, if that's okay with you.
It's fine.
Good. So as we were discussing some last week, although, since we spoke, I went back and read Religiousness in Yoga again. And, it's funny because I had read that book before many years ago. I have the copy from many, many years ago. But when I read it last time, what I read in it was different than this time. Like it almost seemed like there were sections of it that I thought that book was talking about. Last time I was really focused on like the practice sections in that book when you talked about breath in asana and sthira sukha and bandhas and the way that he was teaching those things.
Yep.
Is what I remembered from that book, but I didn't seem to even remember a whole bunch of stuff that was discussed in those conversations.
Yeah.
And even the title, Religiousness in Yoga, seemed to elude me some. But what I would say is last time we spoke 5 years ago, you did talk about that course at Colgate University in 1976 and your participation in it. But we kind of just moved on from there to lots of other things that happened. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring you back today is to talk more specifically about the substance of those talks that you participated in.
Sure. I mean, it was a broad swath, it was an introduction to the depth of the tradition of yoga, including its practical application.
Well, I guess my first question about it or curiosity about it comes from the title. I know you were involved in the editing process as well, and I'm curious who came up with that title. And I read in the introduction, and I'm going to quote it, it says, This book is a result of an act of sharing a religious undertaking, an act of sharing now appearing in printed form.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued by that because I'm curious, do you think that everybody involved thought of it as a religious thing, or was it a college course? Because I took lots of courses on religion in college, but I didn't think of them as religious experiences necessarily. So I guess I'm curious what you thought of it as and what you think some of the other people involved thought of it as.
Sure. Well, first, let me give you a context so that you can understand it. Colgate University, where I went as an undergraduate, there was an extraordinary teacher there named Kenneth Morgan, who was from Harvard originally, and he was one of those original scholars, and I'll put this in quotes, studying, quote, a religion other than one's own. And this is in the academic world of religious studies. And he wrote 3 seminal books, one on Islam, one on Hinduism, and one on Buddhism. And the way he wrote those books, and he did other things, of course, but the way he did was he got leading scholars from within those faiths, and he created an outline, and then they wrote, the book was chapters written by different leading scholars from each of those faiths. Like in the Islamic book, it was leading Islamic scholars. In the Hinduism book, it was leading Hindu and Vedic scholars, and in the Buddhist book, leading Buddhist scholars. And he was very loved. He ended up retiring to Princeton, but he had an anonymous donation, and they built a building called Chapel House just off the campus of Colgate, just above the campus. And Chapel House had a religious library of all world religions, had a religious music library, had a big meditation / ceremony, like you could call it a non-sectarian church with no symbols in it. And then it had a caretaker that lived there 24/7. And there were 7 rooms, like monk-like cells. And then people could go do retreats there. So I had encountered that place my freshman year, and I was a religious studies student. And, I did my first, what's called January program, the year before Desikachar came, in a private retreat studying Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching. And then I met yoga. Then I encountered Mary Lou Skelton, and to make a long story short, went to India. And then when I returned from India, we invited Mary Lou Skelton, the woman that was his student, and we invited him to Colgate, and he came for a January program. I was in India in 1974. In 76, so I guess it was actually 73 that I did the Lao Tzu thing. Then I went to India, and then the following year, we invited Desikachar, and he gave this retreat at Chapel House. I stayed at Chapel House with him and Mary Lou Skelton, who is the professor, the teacher of yoga. And it was sort of under the auspices of the religious studies department. And Kenneth Morgan had retired, but John Ross Carter was the professor. And maybe this is too much information.
No, this is awesome.
Okay. So John Ross Carter took over for Kenneth Morgan as the chairman of the religious studies department, which means that he was the one who ran Chapel House. So Desikachar came to Chapel House, which was a non-sectarian retreat center for the study of world religions or any particular thing that you wanted to study. So like I said, I guess it was in 73 that I did my first January program there. They had a 1-month January program at the university, and that was a private retreat on Lao Tzu. And that was with Ken Morgan, because that was before he retired. And then he retired. I went to India. Kenneth Morgan helped me make the connection to Mary Lou Skelton, who was a student of Krishnamacharya. That's how I got to India, through Kenneth Morgan. So Kenneth Morgan connected me to Mary Lou Skelton, and then he arranged coursework for me when I went to India at Madras University when I was studying Shaivite Siddhanta, which is a South Indian Tantric tradition. And that's when I met Krishnamacharya and Desikachar, right? So it was 76, so that was 2 years later, that Desikachar came and we did this program. Because it was under the auspices of the religious studies program at Chapel House, it was conceived of as an experiential immersion in the science of yoga, which is oriented towards understanding the meaning and purpose of life, achieving happiness in the present moment, and moving towards, the ultimate potential of a human being. So it was intended as a practical immersion in a religious experience. That's how it was intended. Probably the title of the book titles are tricky. Often the publisher wants to name them, but John Ross Carter was the professor who got the publisher, University Press of America. So I suspect that the title came as a mixture of John Ross Carter's plan and the publisher, and the fact that it was sort of sponsored by the Religious Studies Department. So that was a long-winded answer. I apologize.
No, it was great. I guess I'm curious, was that common at Colgate University, that studying religions was experiential more than no academic pursuits of it?
It depends upon the professor, but all of religion is about experience, ultimately. So the academic study of, in fact, just to make a connection, after I lived in India, and we had this conversation in our last meeting when I explained to you that I was a religious studies student, Desikachar pushed me into yoga therapy. But all of basically religion is a process of finding a meaning and purpose in life. It's not just an academic pursuit. So, of course, you can do the academic study of religion, but that's missing the point of religion. I was going to say that after I came back from several years in India, I went to graduate school for a PhD in religious studies. And back then there was a fight in the religious studies department around the issue of hermeneutics, which has to do with the philosophy of interpretation. And the question is, can you put your own conditioning in what they call in a state of phenomenological epoche, sorry for the technical terms, and really objectively study another religion, or does your own conditioning influence how you understand it? And I got so frustrated by the academic argument, and I actually confronted the chairman of the religious studies department. This was University of California, Santa Barbara. And he said, you're interested in wisdom. We're not interested in wisdom. We're interested in knowledge. And that's when I quit my program. I ended up going back later and finishing. But anyway, because I just couldn't. And
that's to my question, what you just said, the difference between the knowledge pursuit or the pursuit of religion for wisdom or for personal spiritual growth or something.
Exactly. I mean, philosophical teachings, philosophical discussions like we were going to talk about some other philosophy, that has a role. But in the ancients, philosophy was intended to provide a foundation and a compass on life's journey. It wasn't just some random academic knowledge or information. It was to help us orient our lives and discover the relationship between philosophy and how to live our life in a meaningful way. That's the original intention of it. Well,
it's interesting to me because, like I said at the start of this conversation, when I read that book years ago, it's almost like there was the idea that it was thinking about religion was not on my thing. A lot of us were taught that yoga is not a religion. And that, a lot of us left we're rebelling against the organized religions of our parents.
Of course.
Coming to yoga because we wanted something ancient and sacred in our lives, but we thought that was all hypocritical bullshit. So we came to yoga. But yoga, I guess I'm curious about the idea between the word religiousness and word religion. And it seemed to me that Desikachar in those talks, he did sort of present he made a distinction between Kriya Yoga, where yoga can mean one thing, to act in a particular way with all of your attention focused upon that action, if I recall, something like that. But then he said that another kind of classic definition was to be one with the Lord. So he seemed to make a distinction between, like, within yoga, there being a more like what we would think of as religion as a theistic viewpoint, or like non-religion atheistic viewpoint. Is that an accurate assessment of what he was saying in those conversations?
I think that I need to backfill a little context.
Please do.
So, and Desikachar expressed this very clearly at Colgate as well, and we've talked a lot about it over the years. So first, let me go back to this idea of yoga as a religion or not a religion. Yoga is a non-sectarian science of transformation that appeared in the context of religious traditions. So yoga is not a religion, but it's the science that's underneath all religions. And I'll explain this just a little bit further first, and then I'll come to, that discussion. So Patanjali the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali were composed prior to the emergence of what in the modern world we call Hinduism. Those are the Bhakti religions around Vishnu and Shiva and Ganapati and the Devi, the Shakta traditions. And those religions all adopted Patanjali's path of practice, but rejected Patanjali philosophically because he didn't talk about Ishvara, or God, the Lord, as creator. He almost was more focused on like what I would call a depth psychological relationship, talking about the phenomenon of faith, not talking about the metaphysical nature of the Godhead, which is what's going on in religions, in theology, but rather talking about what's the effect of faith in the divine, or faith in anything that takes us beyond our own self-importance for a human being. So he didn't talk about Ishvara as the Lord God creator. He talked about Ishvara as a symbol of that which takes us beyond our mind, that gives life meaning. And then what's the impact of having a relationship with that, whatever that is for you, in terms of your own experience of suffering and ultimate freedom. So it's a science of religion, but it didn't belong to any particular sectarian faith. And in fact, it was adopted by different sectarian traditions within India, including Vaishnavites and Shaivites, and even different, quote, religious traditions that battled each other. They all had a science of spiritual evolution that drew on the yogic teachings. So yoga is non-sectarian, but it's not secular. Traditionally, it's not secular. It's not like there was yoga gyms in ancient India. It was taught in the context of religious traditions. And it was a science that helped practitioners go closer to God, or to connect to true sources of inspiration, find meaning and purpose in life, find fulfillment, and prepare for end of life. So that yoga was used by all these different religious traditions. It wasn't sectarian, but it wasn't secular. It wasn't like a yoga gym for fitness. Although later it evolved into, like, it connected with Ayurveda, into therapeutics to help people deal with suffering. Short-term things like sleeping better, having more energy, managing back pain, all of that is an evolution of yoga. But traditional yoga was really only about self-realization, which was equivalent to God realization.
So are you saying that there is no such thing as secular yoga?
No, I didn't say that. I said traditionally there was no such thing as secular yoga.
Yeah.
In the modern world, we've created a secular yoga, and that's fine. We've fragmented. Yoga was presented as an integrated system to address the totality of the human system. And in the modern world, it's been sort of dissected. And so we have those interested in yoga as a form of physical culture, physical fitness. Maybe somebody else is interested in as a science of meditation, but it's all sort of separated. But in the tradition, it was not secular.
I've had so many people on the show talk about Patanjali's yoga as distinct from, like, the yoga of Bhagavad Gita as almost like distinct from Vedanta, as like these are different understandings of yoga. But it seems to me that you're saying that there's something that's universal behind all of those things. Is that what you're saying? Or are those, they're distinct traditions, but they're drawing upon the same sciences? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that, unfortunately, a lot of things that what we tend to do is pick and choose the things we like without really looking deeply at the whole. And, all my life, and it continues, I spend multiple hours every day, just where you see me now, immersed in the study of these ancient texts. This is my weird life. And so when you really study deeply, you see that they're not fragmented. They're different paths. They're slightly different paths. They're slightly different philosophical orientations, and there are slightly different symbol systems that are used, but they're all pointing to the same human experience. And so Patanjali wasn't a theologian. The Yoga Sutra text is not theology. It's more like depth psychology. That's the modern word I use, not DEPTH, depth psychology, which is a study of the relationship between what's going on at the level of our unconscious or subconscious and the transpersonal, and what's going on in relation to our personal experience as it relates to the whole experience of humanity and the dimension beyond the material plane. And so he was like talking about the human psychology in an ancient time when mostly the other kind of writings were about the path to God, which is, so Patanjali said, yeah, there is a path to freedom. Some of you call God Shiva, some of you call God Vishnu, some of you call God Allah or Jesus or whatever, but the same science underneath is there. And so he was laying out the Kriya Yoga, for example, is the science of transformation that leads to freedom, or leads to God realization. Krishnamacharya told me personally that if you look at Patanjali, he's saying that a lot of our suffering is the result of a misunderstanding of what's going on. He uses the word avidya. And in a very sort of non-sectarian way, he says the goal is viveka khyati, the dawning of discernment or discriminative awareness, from which we can to distinguish between the real and the unreal. And then when we do that, we have what's called Purusha Khyati. This is Patanjali's language, or Vedic language, Atma Vidya, sort of self-realization or knowledge of who we truly are. And then there's the phrase Ishvara Khyati, which is like God realization. Krishnamacharya told me that Viveka Khyati, Purusha Khyati, Ishvara Khyati, same. That's Indian English, same. That is ultimately when you have self-realization, you achieve God realization, or when you achieve God realization, you achieve self-realization. When you can see the true nature of everything, Viveka Khyati, you see who you truly are, and you experience the divine, or God. That word God is a symbol that people, and you're one of them, tend to react to, but it's just
I was trying not to. I'm learning not to react so much.
It's a symbol system. So we have to understand the difference between philosophical language and symbolic language. Philosophical languages use rationality to explain the nature of reality, and its role, understanding its role in our own experience. And then, the goal of that philosophy, though, is to awaken to the truth, that truth that will lead us from suffering to freedom, from suffering, from, as the ancient prayer says, from darkness to light, from death to immortality, asatoma sadgamaya, that famous Rig Vedic prayer, ancient prayer. So the goal of philosophy, and then how do we express the inexpressible in human language, is through symbols, living symbols that express something that we can't wrap our brains around. And the symbolism of the divine is that.
Well, on the show here, we had been talking about like Atman and Brahman, and those words don't get used in the book, but he does use the words Purusha and Ishvara in similar ways, it seems to me. Like Purusha could almost be like what someone might call a soul, and Ishvara might be what someone might call a Brahman, like a higher power.
Exactly. From the perspective of avidya, let's call it, of not quite seeing clearly everything, Brahman is Ishvara, right? And Purusha is the Sankhya yoga word for Vedic term Atman. So Atman and Brahman in Vedic teachings are one and the same. So does that mean that, in religious traditions, there's this argument about the immanence or the transcendence of God, right? And the mystics say the immanence of God, and then the traditional religions, people say the transcendence of God. And you see that in Western religions. You see Madhvacharya and the Dvaita dualistic tradition says God is wholly other. The Advaita tradition says they're all one. It's, and the Vishishta Advaita tradition says, it's really one, but there's a distinction between Ishvara and Atman, or Brahman and Atman.
Didn't Desikachar use like a metaphor of like pottery needing like a potter to create the pot that the clay can't make it? Make itself. So he does make a case in those conversations for there to be a creator of sorts.
Yes, it Patanjali doesn't use that concept of creator, and thus he was rejected by the Orthodox, although his methods were appropriated, because he's simply not doing theology. But all the religious traditions of the world, let's put Buddhism aside. There are non-theistic religious traditions, clearly. But most of the theologically based traditions talk about creator.
Mm-hmm. I guess, do you think that some of what you're saying is contingent on this idea that the commentary was written by someone other than Patanjali? Because I've had people on to some people who think that the Vyasa commentary was written by the same person, and some people who said no, that there's actually distinctions between like translation of the sutras and then what the commentary is saying about them. Because if the commentary was written by the same person, doesn't that also offer a certain interpretation that might be different than some of what you're saying? Because isn't there an interpretation of sutras where like freedom or God realization involves almost like not being in this world anymore, or something like a transcendence as opposed to a more
that's
like
an interesting that's a sort of that last piece that you said, let's bracket that for just a second, because that comes to the distinction between Advaita and Vishishtadvaita and Dvaita. Mm-hmm. That point that you just made, but this is, of course, much later historically than Patanjali's text. Mm-hmm. So these distinctive traditions of Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, and Madhvacharya emerge in the AD period. And we don't know exactly when Patanjali was, but certainly we know that they emerged after Patanjali. So your first comment was about the Vyasa Bhashya, which is the commentary, and Patanjali. And, I've been an academic since the early 1970s. And I know there is scholarly disagreements about the dates of these texts, including the date of Vyasa. I know that there are things in the 3rd and 4th chapters that are in response to Buddhist thought. So some scholars will say Patanjali is like 200 BC. Some can date it as late as 280, but not much later. Vyasa, I've never heard, and it's interesting that you have, and I've been in this field a long time, someone say that Vyasa was Patanjali the same author. There is a legend that says that Patanjali was an incarnation of Ananta, which is the Nagaraja, the king of the divine energy beings who supports Lord Vishnu on his lap who provides a bed for Lord Vishnu on his coiled belly, he's a serpent, while holding the whole earth on his head. That legend says that Charaka Samhita, Mahabhashya, and Yoga Sutra are all written by the same being. Charaka Samhita is the source text of Ayurveda. So they say Charaka and Patanjali are the same being, but I've never heard anyone say, there's arguments about who Vyasa was. There's a famous Veda Vyasa that predates the Vyasa Bhashya, maybe author of, Brahma Sutras, maybe of Bhagavad Gita. There's a lot of uncertainty about these things. But that Vyasa commentary is post-Patanjali, as far as I understand. I never heard them equated, Patanjali and Vyasa, as the same. I never heard that discussion.
There's definitely some folks who've made that case. Like, I guess there's a couple academics who wrote some stuff about how they thought that it was the same person. But I know that I remember talking with Chase about it and him saying no, and him talking about the translations and how he thought it was clear that there was something that was being said in the sutras, but that the commentary, he disagreed with something that the commentary was saying or something like that.
I've spent a long time with Vyasa, and he offers a lot of clarity, but also it's clearly not, it's a different, I know enough Sanskrit to know that the language is different. Mm. I'm not a great Sanskritist at all. I don't make any claims to that, but I've been working with Sanskrit for 30 years or more. And I would say that the language style of Vyasa is different than Patanjali.
That's interesting.
But I don't know.
Definitely have had people. I've had people come on who've talked about how they feel that, like, Desikachar and Krishnamacharya, I think as well, utilized Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, but almost with like a tantric lens on it. That the letter of Patanjali is this more dualistic, transcendental idea, but that they had like a tantric lens. But you're saying no, Patanjali was a non-sectarian thing that could have been applied to a lot of different religious traditions ultimately.
Metaphysically, and there's no academic argument about this, metaphysical teachings of Patanjali are rooted in the Sankhya teachings of Kapila. Now, the Sankhya Sutras of Kapila have been sort of lost. The oldest text is the Sankhya Karika of Ishvara Krishna. But the dualism of the seer and the seen is coming from Sankhya. Sankhya, the original Sankhya, does not include Ishvara. Patanjali includes Ishvara. And, there's three. Krishnamacharya used the image of an old man holding a cane. So there's the old man, there's the cane, and then there's the holding of the cane to describe the yoga, the yoga process of the mind linking to something that takes it beyond itself. So there isn't an argument, though, that the question is the dualism of Patanjali an epistemological dualism or an ontological dualism?
Oh, can you explain what that means? I think I know what you mean. Can you explain that?
So epistemology is how we know. And so we understand the world through models. Our science is models that describe something that's in external reality. So the model of dualism is a way of explaining, like, for example, I'm talking to you, right? I know from a non-dualist perspective, but we're one. But from a practical perspective, I'm talking to you, and I'm holding my glass of water. Mm-hmm. So that's dualism. That's epistemological. That's not saying that ultimately, we know in science that ultimately everything's made up of, star dust, right? The minerals of our bodies and the glass and the water all come from that same mula prakriti in Sankhya. So an ontological dualism would say that they're distinct and completely separate principles of reality. An epistemological dualism says practically our experience is subject and object. And my contention, for the sake of the conversation, is that we don't know for sure where Patanjali was coming from, but it appears that it's more an epistemological dualism than an ontological dualism. I don't know. I apologize for those who haven't studied these words. Then you can get lost in it.
No, it's good. It's exactly what I've been hoping for from this conversation, because I have been sort of probing these conversations, and there's something very unifying about what you're saying to me, because I feel like I've often in the past put things into different camps or categorized things in ways that wasn't understanding the more kind of organic whole that you're kind of pointing to, which seems to me fitting, which is sort of the challenge for a Western mind in a way. I guess it goes back, I'm wondering about that one thing that we put a pin in before about whether or not, but whether or not, I think whether Patanjali is teaching us to, like, is freedom transcendence of all of this, or is freedom living within it in a better way, or?
Well, so, I mean, Patanjali doesn't address some things that you see, what is moksha, according to, like if you think of Madhvacharya, I'll work with the symbolism of the Dvaita of Madhvacharya, that in heaven, and I hope no academics will listen, and this is not perfectly expressed. I could, if you give me 5 minutes, even check my notes, but like at the end of life, you go to heaven. And in heaven, God lives, the divine, Brahman, whatever, lives in a palace. And if you're a servant of God, moksha means you are outside the door of God's palace. You never really become one with God, but you're outside the door and you get to be in the realm of the divine. In Vishishtadvaita, you get into the palace and even into the throne room, and you're close to God. And in Advaita, there's no difference. You are that.
There's no palace. There's no palace.
And so these are just like, I could be more precise with my notes. I haven't studied this particular thing in some years, but there's a difference, but it's a symbolic difference. Because who knows anyway? How can we know that? The mind, there are things that are beyond our mind's capacity to contain.
I guess my answer to that, you're right, we can't know that. But the reason why I've been asking the question, I think, is because there is yoga teachers I've spoken to who are kind of materialist in their view as well. And it seems to me that the view where there's no palace, where there is no Lord, lends itself to like a more, transhumanist view even, or something like that. Like you can have like a new age spirituality that comes out of certain Advaita ideas. As opposed to,
is that what you mean? Advaita?
Yes.
Non-dual, Advaita,
Yes. That there's a certain kind of like, there's no right or wrong. And I guess for me, and it's very personal, and I've talked about this a lot on this show, it does seem like yoga, the yoga that I resonate with teaches that there is something bigger than me. That there, I guess that would be how do you say it right? The Vashishtha Advaita? Vashishta.
So the word Dvaita means two, Advaita means not two. So Vishishta Advaita means qualified not to.
Yeah.
So Dvaita is usually translated dualism. Advaita is usually translated non-dualism. And then Vishishta Advaita, because Vishishta means distinct or particular. So Vishishta Advaita means qualified non-dualism. So that's what those words mean.
But I guess I used to feel like there was no qualifications, and now I feel like there is. And are those things in any way at odds with one another? Or
don't think so. Personally, I think that they're different ways. They're working with different models and symbols to help human beings. Let's go back to Patanjali. Patanjali's journey is freedom from suffering, and ultimately self-realization. That's kind of what Patanjali is talking about. And you can believe in Buddha, Krishna, Jesus, Allah, Muhammad, Radha Krishna, whatever, or be an atheist. In the human experience, we have suffering and confusion and make poor choices that creates karma, creates consequences that we suffer from. And the yoga is a science of understanding and then realigning our lives so that it's aligned with dharma. And you said no right and wrong. There's no religion, there's no yoga that doesn't talk about dharma and adharma.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.